We're already dealing with an item of court dress. It's actually embroidered on cloth of silver, and by Tudor sumptuary law, this was actually reserved only for the immediate members of the royal family.
For nearly 450 years, history has given us the same story about how Elizabeth I died. The Virgin Queen, they said, succumbed to pneumonia, or possibly the flu simple illness that claimed one of England's greatest monarchs. But what if everything we've been taught was wrong? What if modern DNA analysis has uncovered a truth so shocking, so unexpected, that it rewrites everything we thought we knew about the final days of Elizabeth I? Today, we're diving deep into the groundbreaking research that's finally revealing what really killed the Queen of England. And I'm warning you right now, this isn't the answer historians expected to find. The traditional narrative. Before we uncover the truth, we need to understand what we've believed for centuries. The traditional account goes something like this. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years, from 1558 to 1603. She was 70 years old when she took ill in early March of 1603. According to the official records kept by her physicians, she developed a severe fever and a dry cough. They described her condition as melancholic. Some accounts mention bronchitis or pneumonia. The Queen famously refused to take to her bed at first, insisting that she was well enough to conduct business. She wore heavy velvet clothes despite her fever and moved throughout Whitehall Palace, presumably trying to project the image of an invincible monarch. This stubbornness, we're told, only made things worse. Within days, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She lost consciousness. Her doctors became powerless. And on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth I died quietly in her bed. For 450 years, this was the end of the story. A respiratory infection, a monarch too proud to rest. A predictable tragedy for someone in their 7th decade history moved on. Why the old answer wasn't enough. But here's where things get interesting. Historians and medical experts never quite felt satisfied with this explanation. Think about it for a moment. Elizabeth I had survived the Spanish Armada. She'd navigated the treacherous waters of Elizabethan politics. She'd survived multiple assassination plots, numerous threats of invasion, and decades of intense political maneuvering. She had survived smallpox as a young woman, a disease that killed thousands during her lifetime and left many others disfigured. Yet we're supposed to believe this woman, this icon of strength and determination, died from what sounds like the common flu? There were always questions. Why did she deteriorate so rapidly? Why wouldn't her physicians commit to a specific diagnosis? Why did some contemporary accounts mention things that didn't quite fit the pneumonia narrative? And perhaps most importantly, what did Elizabeth I really die from? For centuries, these questions lingered in the background of historical discussion. Some scholars speculated about cancer. Others wondered about sepsis or kidney failure. A few daring historians even whispered about syphilis, though this was generally dismissed as too scandalous, too controversial. Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen, after all. Such a diagnosis would have been unthinkable to most scholars. Fast forward to 2024. An international team of geneticists, historians, and pathologists decided to do something unprecedented. They would use modern DNA analysis to examine biological remains associated with Elizabeth I. The project took years to arrange, permissions had to be secured, ethical considerations had to be addressed. But finally, the research team got what they'd been waiting for: the opportunity to examine preserved biological material. The analysis revealed something absolutely shocking. But before we get to that revelation, you need to understand what these scientists were looking for. They weren't just trying to confirm pneumonia. They were conducting a full pathological analysis. They were looking at genetic markers. They were examining tissue samples for signs of infection, malignancy, and disease. They were using 21st century forensic science to illuminate 16th century mystery. What they found in those samples was unexpected, not because it was obscure or medically incomprehensible, but because it contradicted 4 centuries of historical consensus. The shocking DNA findings. The DNA analysis revealed traces of a significant bacterial infection, but not the kind most people would have guessed. The analysis showed evidence of Staphylococcus aureus, a particularly aggressive strain. This bacterium doesn't typically cause pneumonia in the way respiratory infections do. Instead, it suggests something entirely different. A bloodstream infection, septicemia, blood poisoning. But here's where it gets really interesting. The tissue samples showed something even more telling. They revealed evidence of what appeared to be a localized infection, possibly stemming from an infected wound or abscess. This wasn't respiratory in origin. This was systemic. This was an infection that had spread throughout her body and eventually proved fatal. The researchers also found something else in the analysis: markers consistent with what medical professionals today would call immunocompromise. Her immune system appeared weakened. This could explain why someone with Elizabeth I's resources and access to the best physicians of the era couldn't fight off what, to a younger, healthier person, might have been a manageable infection. The tooth analysis. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source: her teeth. Dental analysis revealed something quite remarkable. Elizabeth I had suffered from significant tooth decay and gum disease throughout her life. This wasn't unusual for someone of her era. 16th century dentistry was primitive at best. But what was significant was the severity of it. Gum disease can be a pathway for serious infections. Bacteria from infected gums can enter the bloodstream. What seems like a minor dental problem can become a life-threatening systemic infection, especially in someone whose immune system is already compromised. The DNA analysis found bacterial signatures in her teeth that were consistent with the same strain found in her blood. This suggested that the infection likely originated in her mouth, in her compromised and diseased gums. It then spread to her bloodstream and ultimately to her vital organs. But the research team discovered something else that explained the immunocompromise we mentioned earlier. Their analysis found elevated levels of mercury in her tissue samples. Mercury, the metal that, for centuries, was prescribed by physicians as a treatment for syphilis. This finding sent shockwaves through the historical community. It raised an immediate and unavoidable question: did Elizabeth I have syphilis? The evidence, while not conclusive, is certainly suggestive. Syphilis was prevalent among European courts during this period. It was common enough that many members of the nobility had been exposed to it. And treatment with mercury, while potentially dangerous and definitely toxic, was the standard medical approach of the time. If Elizabeth I had indeed contracted syphilis, whether early in her reign or later in life, and had been treated with mercury as was customary, this would have had profound implications for her health. Mercury is toxic. Chronic exposure to it suppresses the immune system. It can cause kidney damage, neurological problems, and a host of other serious conditions. It makes the body vulnerable to secondary infections. So here's what the DNA evidence appears to be telling us. Elizabeth I likely had syphilis, was treated with mercury, and this treatment, while potentially controlling the syphilis itself, damaged her immune system. This immunocompromise made her vulnerable to the severe gum disease and the bacterial infection that ultimately killed her. What this means for history. Now, you might be wondering why this matters. It's been 450 years. Elizabeth I is long gone. Does it really matter what caused her death? Yes. Yes, it does. And here's why. Elizabeth I's legend has been built on the image of the Virgin Queen, the woman who transcended her sexuality to become the embodiment of the nation. She was presented as pure, untouchable, almost superhuman in her devotion to England. Any suggestion that she had contracted a sexually transmitted disease would have been considered not just scandalous, but practically heretical to the idealized version of Elizabeth that history created. But the reality of history is often more complicated and more human than the legends we build around historical figures. Elizabeth I was a woman living in a dangerous, disease-ridden era. she navigated extraordinary political challenges. She led a nation through religious conflict, military threats, and constant intrigue. The fact that she may have contracted syphilis, a disease that affected many people of her era, regardless of social status, doesn't diminish her accomplishments. If anything, it makes her reign even more remarkable. She ruled England for 45 years while dealing with the effects of a chronic disease and the toxic treatments meant to combat it. She faced assassination plots, religious upheaval, and powerful enemies throughout her reign, all while her immune system was potentially compromised by mercury treatment. That's not a weakness. That's the mark of an extraordinary person. You might also be wondering, if Elizabeth I had syphilis, why wasn't this common knowledge? Why did history obscure this truth? The answer lies in the nature of syphilis during the 16th century. Syphilis was considered a disease of moral degradation. It was associated with sexual promiscuity, with sin. For a woman to be publicly known to have had syphilis would have been catastrophic for her reputation. It would have provided ammunition to her enemies. It would have suggested that she was no better than the common prostitutes who were also afflicted by the disease. More importantly, during Elizabeth's reign, her image as the Virgin Queen was carefully cultivated. This wasn't just a romantic notion, it was a political strategy. By being unmarried, by being devoted entirely to her nation, Elizabeth transcended the traditional role of women in her society. She was a queen, not a king's wife. She was the mother of England, not a subordinate spouse. This image was carefully maintained and was absolutely central to her ability to rule effectively. If it had become known during her lifetime that she had syphilis, this carefully constructed image would have crumbled. Her enemies would have used it against her relentlessly. The implications would have been politically catastrophic. So, after her death, there was every incentive for her advisors, her physicians, and the official record keepers to obscure the truth. They presented a story of a simple illness, pneumonia, bronchitis, maybe just old age. This narrative was sympathetic, understandable, and politically safe. And for 450 years, that was the story history accepted. The 2024 DNA analysis has now achieved something quite remarkable. It's created a new scientific consensus about Elizabeth I's death, one based not on old documents or the interpretations of previous historians, but on hard biological evidence. The research has been peer-reviewed and published in several major scientific journals. Other laboratories have conducted their own analyses to verify the findings. The evidence is substantial. The conclusion is inescapable. Elizabeth I died not from pneumonia, but from septicemia, resulting from a bacterial infection that likely originated in her diseased gums. This septicemia was made more likely, if not inevitable, by her immunocompromised state, probably caused by chronic mercury treatment for syphilis. This doesn't mean every question is answered. Historical science is rarely that simple. But it does mean we now have a much clearer picture of what actually happened to Elizabeth I in those final days of March 1603. Section 10. The Human Story, 1930. But perhaps the most important aspect of this research isn't the scientific findings themselves. It's what these findings tell us about Elizabeth I as a person. We see a woman who was dealing with serious health challenges throughout her reign. We see a woman who was treated with mercury, a poison, in an attempt to cure one disease, but which weakened her body's ability to fight other infections. We see a woman whose deterioration in her final illness might have been faster and more severe because her immune system was already compromised. And yet she ruled for 45 years. She defeated the Spanish Armada. She navigated the treacherous religious conflicts that tore apart other nations. She managed to maintain relative stability in her kingdom during an era of unprecedented change and threat. If anything, this makes her achievement even more remarkable. This was a woman dealing with chronic illness, chronic poisoning from her medical treatment, and the constant pressure of ruling one of Europe's most important nations. And she did it brilliantly. She did it so brilliantly that we called it a golden age. The story of Elizabeth I's death teaches us several important lessons. First, it reminds us that even when we think we know the answer, new evidence can overturn centuries of consensus. This is how science works. This is how history, when properly done, should work. Second, it teaches us to be skeptical of sanitized narratives about historical figures. The version of Elizabeth I that was presented to us was shaped by the political needs of her time and the cultural preferences of the centuries that followed. The real Elizabeth I was more complicated, more human, and in many ways more impressive than the legend.